So you're thinking about the 15-inch M2 MacBook Air versus the base model M3 MacBook Pro? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to the channel. So what we want to do in this video is a lot of people come to me and say, I'm thinking about the 15-inch M2 MacBook Air, and I'm also thinking about, should I actually upgrade to the M3 MacBook Pro, the one that just came out. Now, if you spec out the MacBook Air with a little bit more RAM, which is actually up to 16, which you'll have more than the M3, but if you do that, the prices are very similar. So we're going to talk about what you should do here. And I want to talk first about the benchmarks and stuff, and then we're going to get into some of my kind of conclusions of this. I think it really depends on who you are is the real answer to this. And I'm going to tell you at the end of the video what I think ultimately, who should do what. But really, it's not going to always be a right answer. It's going to depend on what you do and what you need. And we'll talk about that. But really, this is a good question. These things are really close in price when you spec them out a certain way. And I'm going to show you some examples of those being spec'd out as well to show you how close these can get. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, let's just break down some of the benchmarks really quickly. And these are going to just be between, again, the M3 Pro base model, and then we're going to start just with the M2 15-inch Air base model as well. So I'm going to look down here because I got some things written down, but really it's going to be Geekbench 6 single core score. It's 3129 for the M3, and then it's going to be 2629 for the Air M2. Not too far of a difference because those machines are obviously an Air versus a Pro, not as much as I would think, right? You're not going to notice that in a lot of day-to-day stuff, really, for most people. I mean, again, some people might, but for most people, you're not going to even notice that. All right, let's talk about multi-core. Multi-core for the M3 is 11,878, and then for the M2, it's 9,789. Not too far apart again. I don't know what that comes out to, but that's maybe like 15% or something. It's going to be possibly noticeable, but realistically not for most people. You're really going to have a tough time noticing that, especially most people don't even use multi-core and a lot of the stuff they do. So I think that's almost a wash there, depending on, we'll talk about in a second, when we get up to the Air, a little bit more RAM in there. But for now, I think we're kind of, not head to head, but you can see it's not much of a difference. All right, so Geekbench, this is going to be the Geekbench 6 metal score. Now, if you're doing some gaming and stuff, let's just talk about, obviously, the M3 has a 10-core GPU as the base model, and then the MacBook Air has an 8-core GPU. So there's going to be some differences there. So the scores here is going to be 47,590 for the M3, 39,181, sorry about that. And that's going to be for the MacBook Air M2. So again, that's a 20-21%, somewhere in that range. It's a considerable difference, but again, if you're not doing a lot of gaming, you're going to get a few more frames per second, but it's not going to be great either way. So that's not going to affect you. It's going to affect you more when you're kind of pushing the GPU and stuff, and a lot of people just don't do that. So that's number one. If you're not going to be pushing the GPU, you're going to be pushing a little bit more towards the Air. If you're totally GPU dependent on stuff you do and tasks you do, obviously, we're going to talk about the Pro, but that's not my take on this, but we're going to keep going. All right, so for the SSDs, this is going to be where some things change, but we'll talk about this. So for the M3, the SSD speeds, at least the reads here, is 2936, so almost 3,000 megabytes per second. And then on the M2 MacBook Air, it's only 1579. And this is the base model with 256 gigabyte SSD. So it's almost half. Now, again, we're going to show you an example here where we kind of raise it up. And so I'm talking about, let's just assume that you're going to raise this up to the 512 gigabytes. Then they're going to both be very comparable. I think it was like 2800 to 2900. It's going to be very, very close. If you keep it at the base model, the MacBook Air, the M2, it's going to obviously be quite a bit slower on the SSD speed. Most people won't even notice it though, again, unless you're doing, sometimes with file transfers and stuff, you can see it on some website or some channels have tested it. It does take a little bit longer for sure, but overall it's not going to be, 1500 megabytes per second, still really fast. But again, you got to think about it. If you upgrade that to 512, then the SSDs are almost exactly the same. All right, one of the big issues though is the M3 Pro has a fan and the Air doesn't. So if you do something like, let's just talk about Cinebench 2024 scores. It looks like here the M3 is around 635 and the M1 is 439. And that comes out to a whopping 44% difference or somewhere in that range. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because why is that's kind of a GPU test as well, but why is it worse than the Geekbench score that we had before, which was only like 20% difference? It's because those fans really kick in when you're doing really extensive work. huge workloads on the Pro, and that actually helps cool it. On the Air, around the keyboard and stuff, it gets very hot. So you're going to run into some issues there where it kind of throttles down and it can't run at the same gigahertz as the other system, the Pro version. So you're going to, obviously your performance goes down because you get overheated basically, and then you're going to run into some problems over tasks. And this test here kind of pushes it more, and that's why that test is coming out with a further gap there. So in real world testing, you can see here that this is obviously going to be, the M3 is going to be quite a bit better if you're doing really taxing stuff. But ultimately, it's only going to be a few people doing this. I mean, small edits, less than 8 minutes or something for YouTube. I mean, you can wait an extra couple seconds or something. It's not going to make huge effects. If you're doing other things, where you're doing huge workloads and stuff, it could make a big difference. All right, so if we look at my screen over here, you're going to see right here, this is kind of interesting. This is where it gets more interesting. So it's the Apple 14-inch MacBook Pro right here, M3 Space Gray, $1449. We all saw this sale on Black Friday. You may not be able to get it now when you watch this video, but this was actually the sale, and it's probably coming in Christmas too. So $1449, this is the base model, but if you notice the base model only has 8 gigs of RAM, see right there? And then if we go over here, we were able to get the 15-inch MacBook Air. You see it right here. This is back ordered, but again, it was up here for a while for $1499. The cool thing with this version though is if you look down here, this has got 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigabyte SSD. So the SSD is the same, and then the RAM also will be actually double of the M3 in this example. Now you're paying an extra, what, 50 bucks? Let me just see here. So it's actually, the Air is actually more. So there's $1449. The Air is actually 50 bucks more, but you're getting 8 gigs more of RAM. So this is the quandary that we're actually in, right? So you can see these things and you're like, well, this even makes it more difficult. And yes, it does. So what I kind of say is this. At the end of the day, and I'm kind of talking about all this stuff, if you really, the form factor is the number one thing that you need, and you like the Air's form factor, obviously you can get it. Now, when you're going with the 15-inch MacBook Air, though, you don't have the same advantages of the 13-inch MacBook Air because it's going to be quite a bit bigger as far as the dimensions of it. Now, it's not going to be as thick as the Pro, but it's definitely going to be wider and taller because it's 15-inch versus 14-inch. So, but you still get that, a lot of people just like the way it is, the ergonomics of it and things like that. So that's one reason you'd pick that up. But obviously, for the same cost roughly here, if you can go with the 16 gigs of RAM on the Air, then you can, obviously, if you're a user that doesn't do a lot of video editing, but you just do daily tasks and stuff like that, let's say you do, you can just do stuff for work, you do emails, you do web browsing, you do YouTube videos and stuff like that, the M2 Air is going to be really good with that 16 gigs of RAM because, think about it, you're going to be able to open up more tabs with that. You're going to have things kind of less taxing. Your SSDs are going to be about the same speed because you're upgrading that as well. And you can see here it's up to 512. So you're not running into the SSD speed issue either. So it's really just the GPU speed. The CPU, again, speed is fast enough on both of them for almost everybody, so don't worry about that. So it's really those demanding tasks. So I'm not saying get that. I'm saying if you can, if you can get something, like the MacBook Air with the 16 gigs of RAM, with the 512, and you can get it for lower than you can get it on the M3 Pro, then it's definitely something to think about. But if you're a power user and, we haven't talked about this, you like the better screen on it, you also like the more ports on it, on the Pro version. It's got a little bit brighter screen, things like that. Obviously, it's probably got better speakers. Those are things that are also in there as well. Then you should probably go with the Pro. Or if you're a power user, you should go with the Pro as well. The one thing that I want to tell people though is the 8 gigs of RAM is a huge limiting factor, I think, on the Pro version. There's been some tests out there, and you can run into some issues pretty easily eating up that RAM. So I just don't recommend buying the Pro version with the 8 gigs, which brings it up to, obviously, it goes from, $15.99 to $17.99, but you can see these sales, so maybe you'll get it for $16.99. It's all over the place. So it comes down to the price. If you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of money and everything that the Air can do for you is what you need, then you go ahead and buy that. The Pro version, if you know who you are, if you're going to be doing more pro work, video editing, stuff like that, go with the Pro, but always upgrade that RAM. I don't think you're going to be happy at $1,600 when you spend that from a year from now, 2 years from now. You're going to come back and say, why didn't I just spend the extra $200? That's kind of the way I think about all this stuff. So I think this is a tough one, and that's why we're kind of still talking about it, because it's just hard to figure out. And when you get the costs like this so close, and I think that's kind of Apple's kind of plan there. Ultimately, though, if it came to me, this is what I would do. I would save up the extra $200. I would get the sale. I would go with the M3 Pro. I'd have the 16 gigs of RAM on it. You'd have no problems. You'd have the better ports, the better screen, the better speakers, and you call it a day and you don't have to ever look back, and then you're not going to probably be unhappy later. That's my take on it. You guys tell me what you do in the comments. I know there's people that love the Air. I mean, I have Airs and stuff. I love them too, but it's just, I don't know. I mean, one of those things where it's like so close yet so far away. It just depends on what you do. And I think I might do more power, be a power user later. You know, I keep thinking I'm going to be later in life. I'm not, but I always think that. So it'll probably make me more happy to get the Pro. We'll talk to you soon. I hope this helped a little bit. I probably confused you even more than most people probably, but we'll talk to you soon. Peace.